This is lesson number 11 for March 7th through the 13th, titled The Lord Was with Joseph, and it's based on Genesis chapters 37 through 41. An overview of the 12 tribes of Israel can be seen on this chart. And we see that Abraham had his wife Sarah, and from that marriage we have Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah, and from that marriage we had Jacob, who was renamed Israel. He in turn had 4 wives. His first wife was Leah, and from Leah we had several of those sons born to her. Reuben was the first. And then from Rachel, the first child born to her was Joseph. However, when we read in Genesis chapters 33 and verse 32, we read the following. And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. Additionally, we can go forward into 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 1, and it reads, And now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but for as much as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, and the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright. Because of that, Joseph was favored by the Lord. Now we can read in Genesis chapter 37 verse 3, Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now Joseph's coat represents the birthright son. Reuben, again, was the firstborn of Leah, and she defiled his father's bed and lost his birthright. Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, inherited his father's birthright. Joseph is then given a coat that symbolizes the birthright. However, Joseph's brothers become jealous that their father Jacob gave him that coat. In some of the history of that coat and the significance and the symbolism of it, we can read the following. In the 10th century of our era, the greatest antiquarian of the Muslim world, Muhammad Ibrahim Thalabi, collected in Persia a great many old tales and legends about the prophets of Israel. Most significant is Thalabi's discussion of 2 remnants of Joseph's garment, from which we quote, And when Joseph had made himself known unto them, that is his brethren, he asked them about his father, saying, What did my father do after I left? They answered, He lost his eyesight from weeping. Then he gave them his garments, which are long outer shirt, and according to Ad-Dahak, that garment was of the weave pattern design of paradise, and the breath or the spirit odor of paradise was in it. So it never decayed or in any way deteriorated, and that was a sign or an omen. And Joseph gave them that garment, and it was the very one that had belonged to Abraham, having already a long history. And I quoted this from Hugh Nibley in Approach to the Book of Mormon. Now, in the Book of Mormon that was published in 1830, we get the following. Moroni said unto them, Behold, we are a remnant of the seed of Jacob, yea, we are a remnant of the seed of Joseph, whose coat was rent by his brethren into many pieces. Yea, and now behold, let us remember to keep the commandments of God, or our garments shall be rent by our brethren, and we be cast into prison, or be sold or slain. Yea, let us preserve our liberty as a remnant of Joseph. Let us remember the words of Jacob before his death, for behold, he saw that a part of the remnant of the coat of Joseph was preserved and had not decayed. We get that from Alma chapter 46, verse 23. And also in Alma 46, in verse 18, it says, And he said, Surely God shall not suffer that we, who are despised because we take upon us the name of Christ, shall be trodden down and destroyed. Now, in the book of Jasher, which I have been talking about, this was published in 1840. And so this comes 10 years after the Book of Mormon had been in the public. And here we read the following. And Issachar, who is one of the sons of Jacob, he's the brother of Joseph, said unto his brethren, Here is an advice for you, if it seem good in your eyes to do this thing. Take the coat which belongeth to Joseph, and tear it, and kill a kid of the goats, and dip it in its blood, and send it to our father. And they hastened and took Joseph's coat and tore it. And they killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the coat in the blood of the kid, and then trampled it in the dust, and they sent the coat to their father Jacob. So in both these examples that we get in the old writings of the Muhammad from the Arabs, we get that the coat that Joseph had been preserved. And so we get this in the Book of Mormon. But there is no notice that we get none of that in the King James Old Testament in the book of Genesis. Similarly, in the book of Jasher, it corroborates what Captain Rona knew and had learned from perhaps the plates of brass that had additional information that may have been in the book of Jasher, where his coat was torn and then it was trampled on. The Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. But the Lord was with Joseph, and shewed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. We read that in Genesis chapter 39, verses 2 and 3, verses 21 and 23. Now, if we go to the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi, and it came to pass that my father Lehi had also found upon the plates of brass a genealogy of his fathers, wherefore he knew that he was a descendant of Joseph, yea, even that Joseph of Egypt, who was preserved by the hand of the Lord, that he might preserve his father Jacob and all his household from perishing with famine. And they were also led out of captivity and out of the land of Egypt by that same God who had preserved them. And thus my father Lehi did discover the genealogy of his fathers. So again, we have this corroboration in the Book of Mormon that is an ancient document, because again the Arabs knew that the coat of Joseph was preserved, symbolizing that he had preserved the family name or the lineage of the house of Israel. Now we're going to take a look at the correlation between how the story of Joseph of Egypt relates to a typology of Jesus Christ. So I've listed a few here. This is not comprehensive, but it gives you an overview of the parallels that one can find when you study these specific events in Joseph's life and how it parallels that of Jesus Christ. For example, Joseph lived in the land of Canaan, as did Jesus. Joseph's brethren hated him, as did Jesus. The Jews did not like him. In fact, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes really hated him and wanted to crucify him. He prophesied of his destiny, that is, Joseph did. And again, we can look at the prophecies of Isaiah and what Christ talks about himself in Matthew and in John. He does talk about his destiny. Joseph, his father sent him for his brothers who were feeding the flocks. Again, we read the same with Jesus. He was sent to the house of Israel. Joseph, his brothers plotted to kill him. And of course, we know that the Pharisees did the same for Jesus. Joseph's brothers did not believe him and thought of him as a dreamer. And that was also the same of Christ. They felt that he was blaspheming, that he would be actually a son of God. Joseph felt that his brothers taunted him. The same happened with Jesus. His kinfolk, which were from the house of Judah, they taunted him. According to the record of Joseph, Reuben planned to save him. We also have Pilate trying to save Christ when he was brought before Pilate. Joseph was stripped of his special garment. That was the coat of many colors. Same thing happened with Christ. His coat was rent. Both Judah, which is the same thing as the name of Judas, proposed to sell him as a slave. Again, in Matthew, the same name, which is Judah, which is now Judas of the New Testament, he sold him for the so many pieces of silver. I think it was 30 pieces of silver in Matthew, whereas in the Old Testament is 20 pieces of silver. In Joseph, he came from a pit in a tomb, and he came up alive. And we get, of course, that with the garden tomb, he was resurrected, Christ was. The blood that sprinkled on Joseph's coat was presented to his father. And, of course, Christ, his whole body was covered with blood as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when he was crucified, that blood was still on him in his garments. And when he was resurrected, he was able to present himself to his father with that blood. And then he lived with his father before going to a wicked place. And Jesus came from a heavenly realm before he came to the earth.
So let's actually listen to what goes on in the story in Genesis 37, where Joseph's brothers, who have come to really hate him, decide to throw him in a cistern, basically a big underground pit, and leave him there to die. They take mercy on him when their second or third cousins, the Ishmaelites, who are caravanners, come through with all the spices that they've gotten from Saudi Arabia on their way to Egypt. And the brothers get the bright idea, like, well, let's just sell him into slavery. We'll make some money. And then they actually tear up this beautiful clothing that Joseph was wearing and dip it in blood and take it back to their father to convince Jacob that his beloved son Joseph had been killed by animals. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here. What I think is interesting is the price of selling their brother into slavery, 20 shekels of silver. In the New Testament, we have Jesus being sold or betrayed by Judas for 30 shekels of silver. Now, this was essentially the going rate for a slave in these societies. And what's really sad about this is it was actually almost a proverbial phrase to say that something was worthless, to say it was worth 20 or 30 shekels. We actually have in the ancient culture of the time of Joseph, lots of documents have been discovered where, again, people would say something that was trifling amount, that was of almost no worth. You'd say, yeah, it's worth 20 or 30 shekels. And this just suggests what Joseph's brothers thought about him at this point. They didn't think he was worth a lot. Now, what's interesting is we all know how the story ends, that Joseph ends up being the savior to hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. How? Well, to give the story away, he goes into Egypt and he finds a way to serve so well that he becomes second in command in Egypt and convinces people to preserve their grain so that they can weather the famine that is coming. And we'll get to that in future videos. What's interesting is that somebody who was deemed worthless was of great value to so many. Now, I don't know about you, there have been times in my life I have felt really worthless for a variety of reasons, either because of stories I've told myself or stories other people have told, and I believe these things, and whether or not they're true, I end up starting to think that maybe I'm not worth a whole lot to anybody. And yet, God has put each one of us on this earth right now, and we do value. We matter to Him. We have infinite worth. We have friends and others who care about us, and we care about them. And even though there are moments in life we may not feel particularly valued, we can show love and care and concern to others and show that they are valued. And we can choose to remember that as children of God, we are valued by Him. And we do not need to live in the false narratives that we aren't valued either by ourselves or by others.
Joseph resists Potiphar's wife, or the law of chastity. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And it came to pass, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her, or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Now, if we look at that dream that Jacob, his father, had, called Jacob's ladder, we refer to it as, we learned from the last lesson that our church leaders have likened that ladder or that dream to the steps and the rungs to get to the heavenly realm, and that it becomes the temple of a symbol of the temple when we go to the temple to understand our covenants. And so this little representation of that ladder and the temple can be remembered if we think of the individuals that we have encountered in our story in Genesis, starting with Abraham. He learned the law of obedience, and from that he was given a new name. From Abram to Abraham, and his wife Sarai, her new name became Sarah. From their relation, in their marriage, we have Isaac. And from that symbol, we have the law of sacrifice. And as we go up the rungs on the ladder, we get the product of his son, Jacob, learning the law of the gospel. He in turn had his name changed from Jacob to Israel, because he had a wrestle with the God, and with that wrestling he prevailed. So the term Israel means to prevail with God. His son Joseph is the one that we're discussing now. He represents, in this temple experience, the law of chastity and the covenant that we live that law. And from his son, we get Ephraim, who will learn about the law of consecration.
Navy boot camp was not an easy experience for me, nor for anyone who endured it. For the first 3 weeks, I was convinced my life was in jeopardy. The Navy wasn't trying to train me. It was trying to kill me. I shall ever remember when Sunday rolled around after the first week. We received welcome news from the chief petty officer. Standing at attention on the drill ground in a brisk California breeze, we heard his command.
Today, everybody goes to church. Everybody, that is, except me. I'm going to relax. All you Catholics, you meet in Camp Decatur and don't come back until 1500 hours. Fall out! Those of you who are Jewish, you meet in Camp Henry. Fall out. The rest of you Protestants, you meet in the theater at Camp Farragut. Fall out.
Instantly, there flashed through my mind the thought, Monson, you're not a Catholic, you're not a Jew, you're not a Protestant, you're a Mormon. So you just stand here. I can assure you that I felt completely alone. Courageous, determined, yes, but alone. As we go about living from day to day, it's almost inevitable that our faith will be challenged. We may at times find ourselves surrounded by others, and yet standing in the minority. Or even standing alone concerning what is acceptable and what is not.
It's not really me.
Do we have the moral courage to stand firm for our beliefs, even if by so doing we must stand alone?
You guys shouldn't be looking at it either.
It is essential that we are able to face with courage whatever challenges come our way.
And just what do you guys call yourselves?
Until that very moment, I had not realized that anyone was standing beside me or behind me on the drill ground. Almost in unison, each of us replied,
Mormon, sir!
Why you guys go find some place to meet? And don't come back until 1500 hours. Fall out!
It is difficult to describe the joy that filled my heart. As we marched away, I thought of the words of a rhyme I had learned in primary years before. Dare to be a Mormon. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. May we ever be courageous and prepared to stand for what we believe. And if we must stand alone in the process, may we do so courageously, strengthened by the knowledge that in reality we are never alone when we stand with our Father in heaven.
The next lesson, 12, is for March 14th through the 20th, and is titled God Meant It Unto Good, taken from Genesis chapters 42 through 50.
Now, the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him. And he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now, from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
One of the most important part of this story of Joseph in Egypt is when Joseph reveals himself to his brethren. And we can read this in Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 8. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, "Cause every man to go out from me." And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourself, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and the Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt.
13.
Chris Williams, CHRISWILLIAMS. On February 9th, 2007, my family was hit by a drunk teenage driver, and killed in that accident was my wife, Michelle, who was expecting our 5th child, and then my 2nd oldest son, Benjamin, and my only daughter, Anna. It was a Friday night like any other in our family. It was full of fun. We'd gone out to dinner as a family, and my oldest son was off with friends. I saw a pair of headlights coming at me at incredibly fast rate of speed, so as I tried to do some maneuvers to get out of the way, it was too late. We were hit broadside or T-boned. As I surveyed the scene and saw my wife, I saw her chest go down and her last breath leave her body, and I wanted to cry out for her to come back. The next sound I heard was of me wailing and grieving the fact that they were gone. It was as near to an out-of-body experience as I could have, listening and realizing that I was the one making that sound. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. I've never felt so crushed, spiritually, emotionally, and physically.
If you have a teenager out past midnight, you don't like to receive a call I got up and took the phone, and on the other end of the line, a man identified himself as being from the Salt Lake City Police Department. Told us that he had our son Cameron, told us that Cameron was intoxicated, that he'd been in an accident, but he was okay. Then he told us as a result of the accident that 3 people had been killed.
We found out that Sam was the child who had survived. So we went up to the University Hospital where Chris's family were there. Even at that moment, you know, we're all blubbering and crying, and Chris is laying on the gurney in a neck brace. And one of the first things he asks is, how is the young man who was driving the other car?
You know, for the first few months after the accident, I think it was just the initial shock that such a huge part of my life was now gone. And that's a very difficult thing to go through, to kneel down and desire to speak to my Father in heaven when I'm so lonely or when I'm so anguished. It's an interesting conversation to have. You know, he doesn't immediately try and make it better. He listens to me first. And I thought that was very helpful. He allowed me to get that anger off my chest. But inevitably, he would always come back and teach me about his son, Jesus Christ. When I did feel anger, or there was just a deep sense of loneliness, I didn't direct that at the person that had caused this. It directed itself at the Savior. As I looked out the driver's window and saw the overturned car that had hit us and struck us, you know, in my heart I didn't know, and in my mind I didn't understand or comprehend still how it had happened, or who had done it to us, or what the circumstances were. The only thing I remember feeling and sensing is that I needed to let this go.
There's Jesus' way to resolve problems, to address situations, to handle sorrow. And then there's some other way. It's something that I think Chris clued into early in life. And so when the moment came for him in that car, sitting there, I believe he had made the decision long ago what he would do if he was ever in that situation.
About a year ago, Chris and Cameron met for the first time and talked.
The first time that I met him, I was in a room and he walked in and he had a big smile on his face. And I had no smile because I'm facing the man, you know, that I had done this to. He came and he gave me a handshake. He was completely willing to talk about what had happened that night, how he felt about it.
Chris was able to say things that Cameron needed to hear. And he didn't mince words. He let him know how he was feeling, what it meant.
He wants me to let go of what had happened. He wants me to pick a date and forget what had happened, just move on from what had happened completely. There's no way to explain it. It's an overwhelming feeling of thankfulness, of gratefulness, of strength to see him and to see how he's acted in this situation.
After we went to the funeral, one of our neighbors that was at the funeral came up to us and said, "Have you read the article about Chris?" And it was his article about forgiveness. My feeling was that I was just completely overcome with, it was like being washed out, the despair was being washed out from my soul. And knowing that somebody like that could so freely forgive, it was freeing to me to know that he could respond in that fashion.
The thought and sentiment I expressed as I sat down with Cameron was simply this: that if through the forgiveness or through anything else he had seen or heard about me doing after the accident, that he should know it was merely the Savior working through me. I had merely put myself in a situation to be a vessel through which the Spirit, through which his example, through which his knowledge, his intelligence, his brilliance could shine. That's really all I had to do, was to not get in the way of that. I wanted him to understand that I really didn't have much to do with any of the goodness that has come out of that.
It's become more significant to me the fact that he had forgiven me. And I know that's because he knows and he has a testimony and a relationship with Jesus Christ.
I'm grateful that God allows tragedies and trials to occur in our lives. Not because they're easy or because they're desired, but because they help us love. And that too was a wonderful blessing because I saw my brother. Coming to know a man of sorrow and one who is acquainted with grief, as I've now come to understand it, is really why I was sent here. And it has been incredibly difficult to have to learn those lessons in the way that I've learned them. But I've always ended those episodes of grief with an assurance and a hope that one day, perhaps I will see him as he is. One day, hopefully, I will be like him. And one day, I will be with my wife again, as well as the rest of my family. And that's what keeps me moving forward.
So now's a good time to kind of review all of the different stories that we've heard up to this point about all of the key characters and key individuals that are found in the book of Genesis. And so this is a overview of the true birthright sons of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and their parallels. So for example, the older brother had evil or murderous intent toward his younger brother, who should have been his charge. So Isaac was mocked and persecuted by Ishmael. Esau intended to kill Jacob after their father's death, and Joseph's older brothers considered killing him, then sold him as a slave instead. Another topic would be that the brothers were estranged for many years. Isaac remained with Abraham while Ishmael and his mother were sent into the wilderness. Jacob was sent to Haran to protect him from Esau. He ended up staying there for 20 years. Joseph was sold into Egypt while the rest of the family remained in the land of Canaan. Another example would be that the younger brother had many trials but remained righteous. Isaac was offered as a sacrifice to Jehovah by his father, and he had waited to the age of 40 to find a covenant wife, and they had to wait another 20 years to have children. Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah, but had to work twice as long as planned to earn Rachel, and his father-in-law cheated him continually. Joseph was sold into slavery, framed as a sex offender, and forgotten in prison. The younger brother had great spiritual experiences. For example, Isaac was present when the angel Lord spoke to his father at the altar. The hand of the Lord was obvious when Abraham's servant went to find a covenant wife for Isaac, and Isaac also received personal revelation restating the covenant. Jacob saw the vision of the ladder going to heaven. He also received direction from the angel in a dream. He saw angels again while traveling home. Jacob's name was changed to Israel by an angel. Joseph had the ability to receive and to interpret dreams that were revelations. Another example would be the younger brother earned the right to be the birthright son. The Lord established his covenant through Isaac, and Abraham gave him all that he had. Rebekah overrode her husband and arranged the birthright blessing for Jacob. Joseph was given the coat of many colors, and many of the LDS scholars consider that to be a symbolic of his birthright. After his sojourn in England, he was able to take care of his family's welfare, and this carried on to the fourth generation as Patriarch Israel blessed Joseph's youngest son Ephraim with the birthright. And finally, the younger brother prospered eventually. Isaac had 100-fold return in 1 year. Jacob clearly and cleverly increased his own herds despite the cheating of Laban and gave the glory to God. Joseph became a leader in Potiphar's house, in prison, in all of Egypt. And finally, the brothers were reconciled and reunited Isaac and Ishmael together buried their father, and there have been centuries of feuding between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, who are the Jews and the Arabs, and attempts at reconciliation continue through the missionary work of the house of Israel and gathering Israel on both sides of the veil. And Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Joseph invited his brothers to live near him in Egypt, where he could take care of them. He kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. He sent Pharaoh's wagons and provisions with them to Canaan to move their families. Fear not, I will nourish you. If we could have visited Joseph while he was in the pit or prison, how might we have comforted him? How might the thought expressed in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 through 21, help us in times of trial? We can read it here. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, therefore, fear ye not, I will nourish you, and your little ones. And he comforted them, and spake kindly unto them. So I ask you, in what ways has God blessed or comforted you, even through difficult experiences you may have had? And also, how have you comforted others? I testify that these stories can be great sources of strength in our own lives. They are representatives of things that we can experience throughout our lives, and how we can overcome some of those trials, and how some of these symbols that we have learned can help us understand the covenants that we make when we get into the waters of baptism and when we go into the temple and make great covenants that have eternal consequences. I testify to these things and say them in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.